The narrow strip of water between Europe and Asia is not just a geographical boundary. For millennia, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits have been the key to power over the region. Whoever controlled these waters held the destinies of empires in their hands. By the beginning of the First World War, the significance of the Straits reached a critical point. For Russia, they represented the only ice-free outlet to the world ocean. For Britain, a path to its colonies in Asia. For Germany, blocking the Straits meant isolating its main adversary, the Russian Empire. When the Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers in October 1914, the situation dramatically changed. The Straits were closed to the Allies, and Russia was cut off from arms supplies. It was then that a daring idea was born in the highest circles of British command. One decisive blow to the Dardanelles could not only open a sea route to Russia, but also knock Turkey out of the war. In the bloody stalemate on the Western Front, such a maneuver seemed like a brilliant solution. The Gallipoli campaign was intended to be that very blow to the enemy's soft underbelly, which Winston Churchill dreamed of. In November 1914, when the trench lines on the Western Front had already solidified, a young First Lord Winston Churchill bent over a map of the Mediterranean in the Admiralty in London. His fingers stopped at the narrow isthmus of the Gallipoli Peninsula. "There it is," he uttered, "our solution, a blow to the soft underbelly of the Central Powers." Churchill was no novice in strategic thinking. Even before the war began, he had foreseen the possibility of conflict with the Ottoman Empire and understood the importance of the Straits. Now, with Russia cut off from Allied supplies and the Western Front turned into a bloody meat grinder, his idea gained particular appeal. "One decisive naval strike on the Dardanelles," he argued to the war cabinet, "and we will open the way to Constantinople. Turkey will exit the war, the Balkans will side with us, and Russia will receive the necessary supplies." Churchill's plan was audacious, but not devoid of logic. The British fleet, the strongest in the world, was to break through the Straits, suppress coastal fortifications, and appear before the capital of the Ottoman Empire. It was assumed that the mere sight of British dreadnoughts would be enough to cause panic in Constantinople and force the Turkish government to capitulate. However, from the very beginning, the plan met with resistance. Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, was skeptical. "The Navy cannot capture territory," he objected. "We will need land forces, which we simply do not have." A real struggle ensued between the admirals and generals. Admiral John Fisher, the first Sea Lord, initially supported the idea, but soon began to express doubts. He feared risking the newest dreadnoughts in narrow straits, where they would become vulnerable to mines and coastal artillery. Churchill, however, remained resolute. For him, the Gallipoli operation was not just a military necessity, but also a political opportunity. A successful campaign could change the course of the war and strengthen his position in the government. In January 1915, the British War Council finally approved the plan. It was assumed that the operation would be purely naval, without significant involvement of ground forces. This fateful error laid the foundation for future tragedy. On March 18, 1915, 16 British and French battleships entered the Dardanelles. They were met by a hail of fire from Turkish batteries. Despite overwhelming superiority in firepower, the Allies suffered heavy losses. 3 ships were sunk by mines, and 3 more were severely damaged. This setback became a turning point. It became clear that the fleet alone was not enough. Now the plan required a large-scale landing of troops on the peninsula. What began as a bold strategic maneuver was turning into a full-scale land operation for which the Allies were unprepared. When it became clear that the Dardanelles defenses could not be breached by naval forces alone, the Allies began forming land forces of unprecedented composition. For the first time in history, soldiers from 5 continents were to meet on the battlefield, under the flags of Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, abbreviated as Anzac, was to play a special role in the operation. For the young dominions of the British Empire, this was the first major military campaign in their history. Australia had only achieved federal status in 1901, and now its soldiers had to prove to the world that they were worthy of being called a nation. "We are going to show the whole world that Australia is no longer just a colony," a 20-year-old volunteer from Sydney wrote in his diary. Similar sentiments prevailed among New Zealanders. Anzac was formed on a voluntary basis. Young farmers, workers, and students enlisted in the army, driven by both patriotism and a thirst for adventure. Many had never left their native shores. Now they were to cross half the globe to fight for the mother country on an unknown peninsula. The British contingent was a peculiar mix of regular units and territorial divisions. The 29th Division, the only large formation of professional soldiers, was recalled from its path to India and transferred to the Dardanelles. They were joined by the Royal Naval Division, hastily formed from sailors and marines. The French Expeditionary Corps, commanded by General Albert d'Amade, consisted mainly of colonial troops, Senegalese riflemen, Zouaves from North Africa, and the Foreign Legion. The French viewed their participation as an act of solidarity with their British allies. Although their main forces were concentrated on the Western Front, coordination between such disparate forces caused difficulties from the outset. British General Ian Hamilton, appointed commander of the Expeditionary Forces, received his post literally a few weeks before the start of the operation. He had no staff, no detailed plan, and not even detailed maps of the area. Differences in military doctrines exacerbated the problem. The British adhered to traditional colonial tactics. The French relied on the experience of North African campaigns, and the Australians and New Zealanders had no established military traditions at all. They were distinguished by initiative and independent thinking, which sometimes led to conflicts with the British command. "These Australians are excellent fighters, but they completely disregard discipline," one British officer complained, to which an Australian captain retorted, "We came to fight, not to march in parades." While the Allies prepared their motley forces, no less intensive preparations were underway on the opposite shore of the Dardanelles. The Ottoman Empire, once called the sick man of Europe, under the guidance of German advisors, was transforming the Gallipoli Peninsula into an impregnable fortress. A key role in organizing the defense was played by German General Otto Lehmann von Sanders. Arriving in Constantinople even before the start of the World War as the head of the military mission, he effectively took control of the reorganization of the entire Turkish army. When the threat of an Allied invasion became apparent, he was entrusted with the command of the Fifth Army, which was defending the Straits. "Every meter of the coast must be covered by fire. Every height must be fortified," such was von Sanders' order. German engineers skillfully utilized the natural terrain of the peninsula, steep cliffs, narrow beaches, and high hills, turning them into a deadly trap for potential invaders. However, the true architect of the future victory was not the German general, but a young Turkish officer, Mustafa Kemal. Commanding the 19th Division, he displayed extraordinary tactical acumen and decisiveness. It was Kemal who insisted on placing reserves on key heights, which subsequently played a decisive role. "I do not order you to attack," he would utter his famous words in the thick of battle. "I order you to die. For the time it takes us to die, other troops and commanders will be able to take our places." German influence was evident in everything, from the organization of artillery positions to the communication system. Turkish soldiers received modern Mauser rifles, machine guns, and even German-style field uniforms. German officers occupied key staff positions, ensuring effective planning and coordination. But it would be a mistake to consider the Turkish army merely a tool in the hands of German advisors. Ottoman soldiers, hardened in the recent Balkan wars, possessed high morale and a willingness to self-sacrifice. For them, it was a holy war, a jihad, for the defense of the last bastion of the Islamic Empire. The geography of the peninsula became a powerful ally for the defenders. The narrow strip of land, sandwiched between the Aegean Sea and the Dardanelles Strait, offered no room for maneuver to the attackers. Any landing could only occur on a limited number of beaches, each of which was zeroed in by Turkish artillery. The hilly terrain with deep ravines and rocky outcrops allowed the defenders to create an echeloned defense. Even if the Allies managed to establish a foothold on the shore, they would have to advance up steep slopes under crossfire from dominant heights. By April 1915, when the Allied fleet had already experienced the bitterness of defeat in an attempt to break through the Straits, the Turkish defense was fully prepared. Minefields in the waters of the Dardanelles, artillery batteries on the shores, carefully camouflaged machine gun nests, and miles of trenches all awaited the uninvited guests. The dawn of April 25, 1915, was deceptively serene. The calm sea off the coast of Gallipoli gave no hint of the storm that was about to break. In the pre-dawn gloom, landing barges, filled with soldiers who did not yet know that many of them would never see another sunrise, approached the 5 designated beaches. On the beach code-named V, the British 29th Division faced its first trial. As the barges neared the shore, a hail of machine gun fire erupted from Turkish positions. The water turned red even before the first soldier set foot on land. It was not a landing but a massacre, Captain Guy Ged later wrote in his diary. Men fell before they could take a single step on the ground. Others drowned under the weight of their equipment, trying to wade ashore. On the adjacent beach, W, the situation unfolded no less dramatically. British soldiers, leaping from the barges, came under crossfire from 3 sides. Turkish machine gunners, perfectly camouflaged on the rocky slopes, methodically mowed down the advancing ranks. But true hell broke loose on Beach X. Here, the landing craft mistakenly disembarked troops not at the designated location, but directly beneath well-fortified Turkish positions. The soldiers found themselves trapped on a narrow strip of sand, unable to advance or retreat. "We were like targets in a shooting gallery," recalled Sergeant James Brooks. "The only cover was the bodies of fallen comrades." In Anzac Cove, where Australian and New Zealand troops landed, a fatal navigational error occurred. Instead of a gently sloping beach with easy access to the peninsula's interior, the soldiers found themselves at the foot of steep cliffs. Here they were met by a young Turkish officer, Mustafa Kemal, whose tactical acumen and decisiveness changed the course of the battle. Seeing the first Australian boats, Kemal instantly assessed the situation and threw all available reserves into the fray. Quote, he said, addressing his soldiers, "Despite the heavy fire, the Australians displayed incredible bravery. They climbed the cliffs, clinging to bushes and ledges, striving to reach the Turkish positions. Many fell, struck by bullets, but others continued to advance." A Turkish officer noted in his report, "In the southern sector of the peninsula, French troops landed on the Asian shore of the Dardanelles, at Kum Kale. Their task was to divert Turkish reserves from the main landing site. Senegalese riflemen and Zouaves, accustomed to colonial wars in Africa, found themselves in completely different conditions, under fire from modern artillery and machine guns. By the end of the first day, the Allies had secured a foothold on the shore, but at a huge cost. Of the 20,000 soldiers who landed, over 3,000 were killed or wounded. The Turks lost about 2,000 men, but held the key heights controlling the approaches to the peninsula's interior. The first day of the operation revealed fatal miscalculations in planning. The lack of accurate maps, insufficient reconnaissance, and poor coordination between the Navy and ground forces all transformed an ambitious plan into a bloody drama. By May 1915, it was clear the Blitzkrieg had failed. The Gallipoli campaign, conceived as a decisive breakthrough, had devolved into a grueling war of attrition. Allied forces, entrenched on a narrow coastal strip, found themselves in a situation no better than on the Western Front, in trenches, under constant enemy fire, but with the added trials of the scorching Mediterranean sun. The trenches, dug into the rocky soil of Gallipoli, became for the soldiers both home and prison, and often a grave. Unlike Flanders, where the main problem was mud and dampness, here the primary enemy was heat. Temperatures soared to 40 degrees in the shade, which was almost non-existent on the open slopes of the peninsula. "We live like lizards," wrote Australian Corporal Thomas Brooks in his diary. "During the day we hide from the sun and Turkish snipers. At night we crawl out to reinforce positions or fetch water. The air is thick with the smell of decay. Corpses lie between our trenches and the Turkish ones, impossible to reach." The shortage of water quickly became a critical issue. Each soldier was allotted less than 2 liters a day for drinking, cooking, and hygiene. This water was transported from ships in tin bidons, which heated up in the sun so much that they were impossible to touch. The water inside became warm and stale, but there was no alternative. Soon, thirst was joined by disease. Dysentery and typhus spread at a catastrophic rate. By June 1915, in some units, up to 70% of personnel suffered from intestinal infections. Field hospitals were overflowing and medicines were scarce. "Men are weakening before our eyes," noted military Dr. Charles Ryan. "Dehydration and dysentery are turning strong men into staggering shadows. Many sick prefer to stay in the trenches. The conditions in the field infirmaries are so dreadful." Flies became a particular ordeal. Millions of insects, attracted by decomposing bodies and waste, swarmed everything: food, water, wounds. They carried infections, turning every meal into a struggle. Soldier ate, holding a spoon in one hand and swatting away swarms of flies with the other. Turkish troops suffered no less, but had an advantage: control over fresh water sources and better knowledge of the terrain. Nevertheless, diseases raged among them too, exacerbated by supply problems. Hopes for a quick victory were replaced by a grim realization of a stalemate. Front lines froze, advances were measured in meters, and the price of each meter was dozens of lives. Soldiers on both sides adapted to a new reality: constant proximity to death. Psychological pressure intensified due to the enemy's closeness. Between some trenches, there were only 20 to 30 meters. Soldiers heard enemy conversations, their coughs, sometimes even laughter. Snipers on both sides turned sticking one's head above the parapet into a deadly risk. "We know them by their voices, they know us," wrote New Zealand Lieutenant William Malone. "It's a strange feeling, to live next to people you're supposed to kill. Sometimes we exchange jokes or cigarettes, and an hour later we're trying to destroy each other." By early August 1915, Allied command realized that without a decisive breakthrough, the Gallipoli campaign was doomed to failure. 3 months of bloody battles had brought no strategic success. Troops were bogged down in trenches, casualties mounted, and morale plummeted. General Ian Hamilton devised a plan for a final large-scale offensive that was intended to turn the tide of the campaign. A key element of the plan was the landing of fresh forces in Suvla Bay, 8 kilometers north of Anzac positions. Simultaneously, Australians and New Zealanders were to attack Turkish positions at Lone Pine and Chunuk Bair Height. The French and British on the southern flank were to conduct diversionary attacks. "This plan is our last chance," Hamilton told his commanders at a meeting before the operation. And they understood it. On August 6th, as the sun was already setting, the Australians launched an assault on Turkish positions at Lone Pine. The preliminary artillery preparation failed to suppress the enemy's defenses. The Turks had created veritable underground fortresses, covering their trenches with several layers of log overheads. When the Australians crossed no man's land and broke into the Turkish trenches, one of the most brutal episodes of the entire campaign began. The fight took place in cramped trenches where rifles could not be used. Soldiers fought with bayonets, rifle butts, shovels, knives, and even bare hands. "It wasn't a battle, it was a meat grinder," recalled Private Albert Facey of the 7th Battalion later. "We were so close to the Turks we could feel their breath. The trenches were so full of bodies that we had to fight standing on our fallen comrades." 4 days and nights this bloody struggle continued. The Australians held the captured positions, but at the cost of 2,000 lives. For this feat, 7 soldiers were awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor of the British Empire. Simultaneously with the fighting at Lone Pine, the New Zealanders made a desperate attempt to capture Chunuk Bair Height, a key point from which the Dardanelles Strait was visible. On the night of August 8th, overcoming steep slopes, they reached the summit and entrenched themselves there. For the first time since the beginning of the campaign, the Allies could see the coveted goal, the waters of the strait. But holding the height proved impossible. Mustafa Kemal personally led a counterattack. On August 10th, the Turks fell upon the exhausted New Zealanders. Colonel William Malone, the legendary commander of the New Zealand Battalion, was killed in hand-to-hand combat. Chunuk Bair was lost, and with it, the hope for a strategic breakthrough. Events unfolded most dramatically in Suvla Bay. Here, the British 9th Corps landed, 30,000 fresh but inexperienced soldiers. They were commanded by General Frederick Stopford, an elderly officer with no combat experience in modern warfare. The landing was relatively successful. The Turks did not expect an attack in this location and had only small forces there. The British had the opportunity to quickly seize the commanding heights and develop an offensive deep into the peninsula. But Stopford displayed unforgivable slowness. "Let the men rest and have some tea." These words of the general went down in history as a symbol of lost opportunities. While the British soldiers rested on the beach, the Turks hastily brought in reinforcements. By the evening of August 8th, when Stopford finally gave the order to advance, the moment was irrevocably lost. Turkish troops under the command of the same tireless Mustafa Kemal occupied the key heights and met the British with a hail of fire. The attacks drowned in blood. By August 10th, it became clear the August offensive had failed. By October 1915, it had become clear the Gallipoli campaign was at a stalemate. After 6 months of bloody fighting, the Allies held only a few narrow bridgeheads, having not advanced an inch towards their strategic objectives. In military and political circles in London, the uncomfortable question was increasingly asked: should this campaign continue? In the darkened hall of the British War Office, Lord Kitchener, maintaining a stony expression, studied the latest dispatches from the front. Casualties were mounting, and Putmost for success dwindled with each passing day. "Gentlemen," he finally spoke, addressing the members of the War Council, "It is time we faced the truth. The Gallipoli operation has not justified the hopes placed upon it." The new coalition government, led by Herbert Asquith, found itself under increasing public pressure. British newspapers, initially supportive of the expedition, now published critical articles, calling the campaign a senseless waste of lives. Winston Churchill's position as the operation's chief architect became particularly vulnerable. In May, he had already lost his post as First Lord of the Admiralty, and now his political career hung by a thread. "It is my responsibility," Churchill wrote in a personal letter to the Prime Minister, "but I still believe the idea was sound. The execution failed us, not the concept." In October, General Charles Munro, who had replaced Sir Ian Hamilton as commander, arrived on the peninsula to assess the situation. His verdict was brief and merciless: evacuate. This word, uttered by a military professional, caused a veritable storm in London. Evacuation meant admitting defeat, something unthinkable for an empire over which the sun never sets. Lord Kitchener, unwilling to make such a radical decision remotely, personally traveled to Gallipoli in November. What he saw only confirmed Munro's grim diagnosis. Soldiers, exhausted by disease and malnutrition, lived in trenches half flooded by November rains. Supplies became increasingly problematic due to autumnal storms, and on the horizon loomed an even greater threat: the approaching winter. "If we remain here until December," military medical officers warned, "losses from frostbite and pneumonia will exceed those from combat." Against the backdrop of these grim forecasts, the strategic situation on other fronts also changed, not in favor of continuing the operation. Bulgaria had entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, posing a threat to Allied forces in Salonika. The Serbian army was suffering defeat. The Western Front demanded more and more men and resources. The War Council convened in London on November 22nd. After long and intense debates, a historic decision was made: to evacuate all forces from the Gallipoli Peninsula. "It is a bitter pill," Prime Minister Asquith said, "but sometimes admitting defeat requires more courage than continuing a hopeless struggle." The decision was kept in the strictest secrecy. Even in Parliament, it was spoken of only in hints. There was fear not only of public reaction, but also that the information would reach the Turks, who could turn the retreat into a catastrophe. Defeat does not always mean complete failure. Sometimes, at the darkest moment of a military campaign, an operation is born that becomes a model of military art. Such a paradox was the evacuation of Allied troops from the Gallipoli Peninsula, the only flawlessly executed part of the entire ill-fated campaign. Planning for the retreat began in deep secrecy. Vice Admiral John de Robeck and General Charles Munro understood the slightest leak of information would turn the evacuation into a bloody massacre. The Turks, sensing the enemy's weakness, could unleash the full power of their artillery on the retreating troops. Quote, stated Brigadier General Alexander Godley at a secret command meeting. Thus was born one of the most audacious disinformation plans of the First World War. The evacuation was carried out in two phases. First, surplus equipment, heavy artillery, and some personnel were removed from the peninsula, maintaining the appearance of a normal troop rotation. Soldiers received orders to fortify positions and prepare for winter. New dugouts were built, and drainage systems were laid in full view of the Turks. Simultaneously, engineering units developed astonishing devices to simulate the presence of troops. A true masterpiece was the automatic rifle with a clockwork mechanism. A simple but ingenious design. A tin can of water slowly flowing out through a small hole, was connected to the rifle's trigger. When the water level dropped, the mechanism activated and a shot was fired. Thousands of such devices, installed in the trenches, created the illusion of intense rifle fire. "We staged whole performances," Captain James Haggard later recalled. "During the day, we demonstratory moved reinforcements, which were secretly evacuated at night. We maintained the usual level of artillery fire, even though there were fewer and fewer guns. Soldiers wrapped their feet in rags to muffle the sound of their steps as they retreated to the beaches. Movement was allowed only in groups of 8, with a 3-minute interval between groups. The last units left the front-line trenches literally on tiptoes, leaving behind working automatic rifles. At the beaches, rowboats waited, silently transporting people to transport ships. The ships departed without lights, with darkened portholes. The Turks, hearing the usual firing from enemy positions, had no idea that only mechanical devices were shooting. On December 19th, the evacuation from Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay was completed. More than 80,000 people were evacuated without a single loss. The Turks discovered the enemy's disappearance only the next morning, when the British ships had already disappeared beyond the horizon. Cape Helles, at the southern tip of the peninsula, was the last to be evacuated. Here the operation concluded on January 8-9, 1916. Despite stormy weather, 35,000 people safely left the shore. The Gallipoli evacuation entered military textbooks as an example of impeccable planning and execution. "It was the only thing we did right in that campaign," Winston Churchill remarked with bitter irony years later. April 25, 1915, a date that forever changed the history of two young nations. On this day, Australian and New Zealand soldiers first entered a major battle as representatives of their own countries, and not merely as colonies of the British Empire. No one could have predicted then that from this bloody defeat would be born one of the strongest national myths in history. For Australia, which gained federation status only in 1901, and New Zealand, which became a dominion in 1907, the Gallipoli campaign became a sort of baptism by fire. The young nations needed their own heroes and national symbols distinct from the British. Gallipoli gave them this. "We went there as colonists," Australian historian Charles Bean later wrote, "and returned as Australians." It was Bean, a war correspondent who accompanied the Anzac troops, who became the chief architect of the Gallipoli legend. In his reports and later in the 12-volume official history of the war, he formulated the concept of a special Anzac spirit. What exactly was this spirit? First and foremost, brotherhood, equality, and mutual support. Unlike the strictly hierarchical British Army, in Anzac units, relations between officers and enlisted men were more democratic. Australian and New Zealand soldiers called their commanders by their first names, which shocked the British. "These chaps recognize no rank but what is earned in battle," a British liaison officer noted. Another characteristic feature was initiative and resourcefulness. Farmers and laborers, raised in harsh conditions, showed remarkable ingenuity in solving problems on the battlefield. Even before the end of the war, both countries began to celebrate Anzac Day on April 25th. The first ceremonies took place as early as 1916. After the war, this day became an official national holiday and remains so to this day. In modern Australia, Anzac Day begins with a dawn service, a symbolic time of the landing at Gallipoli. Thousands of people gather at war memorials across the country. The last post is sounded, followed by a minute of silence. Then parades of veterans and active service members take place. In New Zealand, traditions are similar but have their own peculiarities. Here, Anzac Day is closely linked with Maori culture. Traditional Maori rituals are included in official ceremonies, emphasizing the contribution of the indigenous population to the country's war efforts. Every year, interest in Anzac Day only grows. Thousands of young Australians and New Zealanders make a pilgrimage to the Gallipoli Peninsula to attend the dawn service at the landing site of their ancestors. This phenomenon, known as, quote, has become an important part of shaping national identity for the new generation. The, quote, has extended far beyond military history. It has become part of the national character of both countries. The values of mateship, resilience in the face of hardship, and, quote, are considered typically Australian and New Zealand. Even in sports, particularly cricket and rugby, these countries' teams are renowned for their fighting spirit and cohesion. The Gallipoli campaign left a deep impression on the collective memory of all European powers involved. But each drew its own lessons from this tragic campaign. For Britain, the consequences were particularly painful. A strategic miscalculation of such magnitude dealt a serious blow to the reputation of the empire, upon which the sun never sets. Winston Churchill's political career was jeopardized. He had to leave his post as First Lord of the Admiralty and go command a battalion on the Western Front to restore his reputation. Only his indomitable character allowed him to subsequently return to high politics. In military circles, Gallipoli became a symbol of the dangers of superficial planning and underestimating the enemy. "We were accustomed to fighting natives armed with spears," one British general later admitted. But at Gallipoli, we were met by a modern army with German cannons and machine guns. British military doctrine underwent significant changes. Special attention began to be paid to intelligence, detailed planning of amphibious operations, and inter-service cooperation. The lessons of Gallipoli directly influenced the preparation of amphibious operations in World War II, especially the D-Day landings in Normandy. For France, whose participation in the Gallipoli campaign often remains in the shadows, the campaign had a different meaning. The French Expeditionary Corps, consisting mainly of colonial troops, Senegalese, Algerians, and soldiers of the Foreign Legion, fought with exceptional courage. Despite France's primary efforts being concentrated on the Western Front, sending a significant contingent to aid British allies demonstrated a commitment to the idea of European solidarity. "We fought shoulder to shoulder with our British comrades," General Albert Damade, who commanded the French forces, later wrote. "The common blood shed on the sands of Gallipoli sealed our alliance more strongly than any diplomatic agreements." In post-war France, the Gallipoli campaign was seen as an example of sacrifice in the name of Allied obligations. This experience strengthened France's commitment to collective security, which manifested in the interwar period through support for the League of Nations and the system of military alliances. For Germany, which participated in the campaign indirectly, through military advisors and arms supplies to the Ottoman Empire, Gallipoli confirmed the effectiveness of their military strategy. A small group of German officers, led by General Lehmann von Sanders, managed to organize a defense that stopped the armadas of the world's most powerful empire. This strengthened German belief in the advantages of strategic mobility and the importance of quality command over quantitative superiority. "With the help of a few dozen of our officers," noted German military theorist Hans von Siecht, "we managed to turn the Turkish army into a force capable of resisting the British and French." This proves that the quality of command is more important than the number of soldiers. German military personnel carefully studied the experience of Gallipoli, especially the successful organization of anti-landing defense. These lessons were applied in the creation of the Atlantic Wall during World War II. particular attention was paid to the tactics of using mobile reserves for counterattacks at critical points, a technique so effectively employed by Mustafa Kemal. More than a century has passed since the last Allied soldier left the sandy shores of Gallipoli. But the echoes of those events continue to resonate in the modern world. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits remain key geostrategic points on the planet, control over which still determines the balance of power in the region. After the end of the Cold War, many believed that the significance of the Straits would diminish, but history decreed otherwise. With the resurgence of Russian influence in the Black Sea and the activation of NATO in the Eastern Mediterranean, these narrow waterways are once again becoming an arena of geopolitical rivalry. The Montreux Convention of 1936, regulating the passage of warships through the Straits, regularly becomes a subject of international discussion. Turkey, the heir to the Ottoman Empire, skillfully uses its geographical position, balancing between various centers of power. In the countries participating in the Gallipoli campaign, the memory of those events is preserved differently. For Turkey, the campaign became not just a military victory, but also the cradle of the nation. Mustafa Kemal, who commanded the Turkish forces, subsequently became the founder of the modern Turkish Republic. His words, "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die," are carved on monuments and have entered school textbooks. Every Turkish schoolchild knows about the victory at Çanakkale, as the Gallipoli campaign is called in Turkey. For Australia and New Zealand, the memory of Gallipoli became the foundation of national identity. Anzac Day, celebrated on April 25th, has long gone beyond the scope of an ordinary military memorial. It is a day when Australians and New Zealanders of all generations reflect on the values they consider the foundation of their nations: courage, comradeship, self-sacrifice, and resilience in the face of adversity. It is noteworthy that over the years, this day is increasingly less associated with the confrontation with Turkey and more with the formation of national identity. Today, thousands of young Australians and New Zealanders make a pilgrimage to the peninsula where their great-grandfathers shed blood. They meet with Turkish youth in a spirit of reconciliation and mutual respect. The military lessons of Gallipoli prove to be as enduring as the cultural heritage. The experience of this campaign fundamentally influenced the development of amphibious operations in the 20th century. During World War II, when planning the Normandy landings, the Allied command carefully studied the errors of Gallipoli. The tactics of massive naval gunfire support, the use of specialized landing craft, thorough coastal reconnaissance, all these elements were developed taking into account the bitter experience of 1915. Modern Marines and paratroopers continue to study the Gallipoli campaign as a classic example of what can go wrong during a landing on a hostile shore. Today, hundreds of cemeteries and memorials are located on the quiet hills of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Turkish government carefully preserves these places of memory, understanding their significance for other nations. Every year at the end of April, the peninsula becomes a place for international ceremonies where the descendants of former adversaries pay tribute to the fallen on both sides. This is a rare example of how a place of bloody battle has turned into a symbol of peace and mutual understanding between peoples. Gallipoli reminds us of the fragility of human lives and the futility of military ambitions. What began as a bold, strategic maneuver turned into a tragedy for hundreds of thousands of families around the world. And yet, something significant was born from this tragedy. A new understanding of brotherhood that transcends national borders, and the realization that ultimately, humanity is united by more than it is divided.